So, hi, welcome back to, if you've been here before, or welcome to Liberating Leadership. So our first kind of event in the collective, really, that's had multiple sessions. So we've had a number of really interesting, juicy conversations, and we're hopefully about to go into another. I'm sure we're about to go into another, in fact. So welcoming Esua Goldsmith, and if people want to say hi, you can just type. This is just to show you, but here I am saying hi, and you can also say hi, let us know who you are, where you are, if you'd like to. And also at any point during this conversation, if you want to ask a question, you've got any technical issues, Madeline's there to respond to technical things, and if you want to ask questions, there's a question function. You can also post them in the comments, so you can interact with us as and when you feel like you'd like to, and there's no pressure to. It's open. So for this conversation on creative leadership, I'm here with Esua Goldsmith, and Esua, I just wanted to invite you to tell us who you are.
Hi to all the people who said hi. Just you and Madeline so far, but anyway, the rest of you are probably out there somewhere. Thank you, David. I am I've done a lot of different things. I've been a feminist activist and a student activist since I was about 18 or 19. I was one of the first Black volunteers to go on VSO. I've been a teacher, worked for voluntary organisations, aid and development agencies. I've been chair of different organisations like Fawcett, and I helped to set up the Gender and Development Network and became one of its first chairs, vice chair of Action Aid. So I had a lot of experience with boards, but mainly I think in the last 25 years, since I came back from the Beijing conference, I decided to go freelance and set up a sort of consultant, strategist, facilitator organization of my own, small, and since then I've been a consultant and working with feminist organizations, aid and development organizations, but also in the academic, public sector, publishing sector. I've worked in Europe as well as in all the other continents, and in my village as a local teacher, so as a local leader and traditional leader, and that's my village in Ghana. So I've done, sort of seen other leaders and experienced other leadership roles in a variety of different settings.
Yeah, great, thank you. And I'm actually going to add something, because we know each other a bit, which is that you're also a writer.
Oh yeah, forgot about that.
And we might speak to that at the end a bit. But first of all, I'm going to jump in and ask you. So we frame this conversation as being about creative leadership. What do you mean by that when you talk about it? And how do you think it relates to feminist leadership as well?
Right. Well, we've had a lot of really fantastic examples of feminist leadership and what it means and so on today, which has really been inspiring for me. I've been taking loads of notes. But what I wanted to do was kind of go a little bit wider than that and reimagine leadership for a new sort of feminist era. And I wanted to put those two things together, really. Creative leadership's not an original concept. It's not, it's a thing out there, and it has a lot of the characteristics, I think, of feminist leadership. Shared, distributed, flexible, innovative, imaginative, collaborative, all the things that people have been talking about, fluid, the things we associate with feminist leadership. But at the same time, I wanted to gather the sort of creative leadership in terms of creating something different, not just being leaders in the current situation of patriarchy and patriarchal institutions and a patriarchal society, but think beyond it. How do we reimagine, first day of the revolution, wake up Monday morning, what would the society look like? What sort of leadership would we have? Because I think that's really important right now, to think of what would be different instead of what's bad about what we've got, and how we need to do differently within the current context. So I think we talk about feminist leadership in terms of, the different qualities that women might bring to the table, like, behaviors, priorities, experiences, which I think are really valuable in, to counteract the kind of leadership which we've got now. But I don't think there's enough really of reimagining a leadership in the context of a new feminist world, of an economic world, of creative political ideas, and getting back to the revolutionary roots of feminism. When I was a fresh 19-year-old and thinking about envisioning a new society, we didn't want to just tinker with the patriarchy. We wanted new structures, new systems, not just fixing up the old one. So I'm really sort of thinking, let's think outside the box here. Not just the feminist leadership, not just the creative leadership, but the imagination to think beyond it, put those two things together. And I think one of the things that I've been doing recently is working as a strategist and facilitator for the European Women's Lobby, which is representing all the 28 feminist organisations, feminist movements in Europe, which is really exciting. And they've got that two-pronged strategy. I think that's a really good example of it. They've got a 50-50 campaign, which is saying want parity for all the women who are, for women and men in the European elections, for example. And they've had quite a lot of success with that. But at the same time, parity is not going to fix it completely. You might get Marine Le Pen, well, she's a woman, but basically that's not kind of what we had in mind in terms of leadership. At the same time, they've got something called a Purple Pact, which is actually saying we're not just fighting for this, women for parity, but we're fighting for something new, and we're looking for feminist leaders who are going to think outside the box and present us with a new economic, political and social vision. And I think that's really exciting, because at the moment, when I look at the word leadership, I think it's got lead in it. It's a bit, it feels
right.
I know it's a different, so it's a different pronunciation, but it's the same word. It's light, heavy, and solid, fixed. And we think of all the sort of strongman type of leaders who are personification of that heaviness: Trump, Putin, Erdogan, Assad, Boris. People who are, sort of exposing an old form of patriarchal leadership. And I think we need to see leadership as feminists as an entirely different thing, made up of different molecules, more like an energy and like an electricity. I love the words that people have previously used, previous speakers, like fluidity and energy, and see leadership as an energy and a spark which ignites people's ideas. And it's a continuum, it's going somewhere. And one of the things that struck me was about being a leader is not a zero-sum game. If you think of it as an energy, then you can create as much leadership anywhere you want. It can come from anywhere, and it can go anywhere, and it can take different shapes and forms. So I think that's maybe that fluidity, that feeling as, I don't know, that leadership is energy and power. That will actually enable us to chuck out all the dead weights and start thinking, freeing ourselves up. Somebody talked about it as freedom. I like that idea, to see it as a dynamic thing and a facilitative thing. You're a leader to facilitate things happening. That's what I'd like to see it as.
Yeah, absolutely. And then I've heard you say that creative leaders need fabulous followers, right? So why do you think this concept of followership in relation to leadership, or that relationship, however you want to describe it, really, why do you think that's important? How would you describe it, I guess, as well?
Yeah, I know. I think we are really kind of held back by patriarchal language, this binary leader follower, it's somehow difficult. But if we think about followers being as important as leaders, you could, if not more important, you can't have a leader without followers, without people who say that's a good idea, I'll sign up to that, and make something of it. And so I think you're right, it's a relationship between two dynamic forces, and I don't see followership as being at all passive. I see it as creative, active followership, in which you take leaders' ideas, contribute some of your own, run with it, and so there's this fluidity of being both a leader and a follower. And I hope that most leaders who end up in big positions with big fat salaries are also followers, that they, you know, they presumably they were followers. You have to start somewhere, and you have to start with that, and that they remember that active collaboration between the two, and that you are there because your followers allow you to be, and that followers invest that power in you. And the minute you forget about that, that becomes, you either have to enforce your leadership with the power of a gun, or else you're not really a leader. You're not an effective leader. You're not anyway. So I think we need to see ourselves as both leaders and followers. It's not binary. You can move fluidly from one to another. And I think my first lesson in that came when I was a student activist. I was joined my local consciousness raising group at Leicester University when I was 19, and I eventually, and that's talked all about all the sorts of things we talk about now: self-care, awareness, understanding. That's where we all started, in a movement which was not, didn't have leaders, conventional leaders, and our leaders, writers like and activists like Angela Davis and Alice Walker, and people who were who were thought leaders of ideas and movements and so on. And I then stood as president of the Students' Union, and I was the first woman and the first person of color to be in that position. And I think I would not have had the confidence to go into that role had I not been a follower of a movement and know that I had those that movement behind me, with those ideas. We'd speed read the feminist, the female eunuch, and then rush into the Students' Union and try and make a policy out of it. So it was terrifically dynamic, and that's the sort of ideas that I think feminists have always been great at, and you can see that today. So I think followers have to hold leaders to account, and be prepared to move out that space, as you were saying, and let others in. But I also think we need to support, as followers, we need to support our leaders. I often think that women are very much disproportionately as leaders in the firing line. They get absolutely ripped apart. If you think of the racism that Diane Abbott has experienced, the fact that Jo Cox has been the only MP to be murdered in the UK for for eons, and you think, well, actually there are. I really thought that was heartfelt. Was it Rashini who spoke last, who was talking about just talking about how we, and I think some of your other contributors have said this as well, how we often have the power to hurt ourselves, and maybe we fall short of supporting people when leaders aren't perfect. And show me a leader who is perfect, but sometimes we fall short of actually supporting our female leaders when they put their heads above the parapet. It can be a lonely business, and I think there's a lot of evidence to show that that you get more equality in a society if you have a supportive relationship between the women's movement and female leaders and politicians. So that relationship is key, and it actually produces results. So it's not just important in its own right, it's actually a measure of how well you're doing in terms of producing equality.
Yeah, and I think that kind of brings me on to asking you about what collective approaches to creative leadership might look like, because in a way, when you talk about those links between movements and politics and that kind of thing, and maybe we can think about them in development spaces as well, like what that could look like. But there's something about the collective of different bits of that, isn't there?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, obviously, it seems to me that I think it's already been said that power and leadership need to be closest to the people whose, the decisions affect. It needs to be in that, locus, and the further the decisions and the leadership is from real life and real people. And empowerment, the less relevant and less effective it's going to be. So I think that's important. But one of the things I wanted to pick up on was my experience of working with Oxfam, actually, because I know it's going through a difficult time. The whole sector is going through an existential crisis at the moment. So it's very easy to sort of criticize, the neo-colonialism and the abuse and the fact that these institutions are in crisis and they're no longer fit for purpose. But time was in the 90s, at the sort of heyday of the NGOs, and the INGOs. I was fortunate enough to be the chair of the Oxfam Assembly, and I was there from when was it, 1994 to 1998. We had three during that year. Every other year we had a huge assembly of over, well, I think it was nigh on 400 people, and it was a participatory, creative process. I worked with a team to, and just held it all together as a facilitator. But Oxfam actually brought together people who had straight from the villages, coffee growers, tea growers, craft workers in Africa, Latin America, Asia, flew them to Oxford or wherever, and we had a residential 4-day conference together with shop workers from the Oxfam shops, people from DFID, people from all the other aid agencies, the Oxfam board and some of the other boards, activists, students, whoever, all in this room. And for those 3 days, we talked about the big questions, what is poverty? How can we get rid of it? Should there be an anti-poverty program in the UK? What's the difference between poverty in the UK and other parts of the world, and so on? So we dealt with the big questions, and were in groups. They were in the big meeting room with 350 people. The energy that created and the collective leadership that created, and we came out with some fantastic quality decisions because of the diversity in the room. It was a really extraordinary experience, and it happened in the 90s. So it seems to me that if we're looking at collective approaches to leadership, we certainly need some new ones. We need to put our collective creative thinking caps on to think about new ways of working. But at the same time, we need to look at what's happened in the past. Don't forget your own history. Don't forget the history of the feminist movement, of the aid and development movement, because it seemed to me that where activists congregate is a good space. It might run out of steam, it might run out of time, it might be the legacy of all sorts of things we don't like colonialism, racism, and so on. But if we're in it, we've contributed our lives to this, and there were some really energizing things about it. So I do think that is a really good example of how we can bring people together and get those collective ideas going. But obviously that's an expensive thing to do. You can't do it every day. But I think participatory processes which it used, you can embed into organizations. There's been loads of examples of that we've had today about how you can work in that way and bring that diversity in your everyday practice. So I think that's what the kind of collective approaches might be like, but you'd need to make sure that they led to decisions. That wasn't a decision-making forum, but if you use those collective approaches, you could actually make decisions in organizations based on those kind of things.
Because I was going to ask you, because I definitely have a sense of there having been a time in the 80s, 90s, maybe earlier too, when development was more, there was more. Now, what do I want to say? Because we still have language about participation, but there's been a lot of conversation, right, in the last decade or more, maybe, about how we've kind of co-opted this idea of participation to some extent, right? And we talk about it, but do we do it? You know, that whole thing. So I was going to ask you, like, what went wrong, but it also sounds like, you know, it's like, how do we join that up with power and leadership as well? It sounds like was part of it. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, the fact is we are where we are, you know, individually and collectively, and some of us are working for organizations and some of us are working freelance or whatever, but we've got the we've got to engage with what is and lead it somewhere else. And I think that sometimes we miss opportunities to lead from where we are. And I think you know, after the crash and austerity and more you know, more sort of less civil society spaces and so on, that obviously had an impact on our sector, the aid and development sector. And that meant that, you know, there was a shrinking workforce and people, you know, and a shrinking set of donors and supporters and so on. And so you got that crisis. But one of the things I think is not often talked about is the fact that as a result of restructuring in a lot of organizations, you got a lot more consultants like me. I mean, you know, I've been going 25 years, but, you know, time was I'd be in a room, there'd only be a couple of us and the rest of us would be employed by organizations. And now to me, it's the other way around. You know, there's sort of species of the people who are actually employed, you know, with pensions, etc. But it seems to me that had an advantage to the current structures in that they suddenly got rid of a whole load of feminists who either got laid off anyway or couldn't stand it anymore and left, as one of the other speakers said, because the whole thing was, you know, just not fit for purpose. And so you got a group of consultants growing ever larger, which has effectively been privatized and individualized and in competition with each other, whereas previously we'd be in organizations collectively working as feminists trying to change from within. So it seems to me that suddenly we bought into, I know I bought into the whole idea that consultants were supposed to be neutral, individual. You go into an organization, you get a brief, you follow it, you do what the what your employer wanted, what you were commissioned to do. And if you were lucky, you could bring a little bit of feminism in there, you know, but round the back door.
A bit of what you thought, do
what you're paid for, and, you know, pretend that you're not, you haven't got any agenda of your own. And I thought, why? Why should we be like that? I did a keynote speech for the Management Development Network, which is a group of 100+ consultants who've been working for years in this sector. And I said, why did we ever buy into that? And why don't we market ourselves as a collective entity of consultants who, you know, for the revolution, or, you know, but you hire us, this is what you get. We've got a set of values. Why is it we go into organizations and say, where's your values, where's your strategy, where's your plan, what impact do you want to make, and we don't apply that to ourselves as a group of consultants? So I think actually you can lead from where you are. You can create a space of power and create a space of leadership where people just assume you haven't got one. And I think that can be incredibly energizing and, you know, empowering. And I think we can do a lot of stuff with that. And you think, oh my God, nobody's going to hire me if I go, you know, to spout my ideas. But I think that people are in such an existential crisis these days in every sector that they're looking for people who've got some kind of concept of where they can go and how they can do differently. And one of my examples that recently, I was working with the Carnegie Prize for Children's Literature, and they've been going 85 years, and in all that time they've never awarded the prize to a person of colour, which is an extraordinary record, and people were beginning to pick up on that, the press and so on. So they hired me to facilitate that and to help the whole organization rethink itself. And within a year, they've now given the prize, it was announced last week in the press, to a Black woman writer. So it seems to me people do and can change, and we can all be change agents and work from where we are. And you think that an organization with that amount of history might not be able to make the shift, but if there's a political will and you can turn that on and work through that participatory process where everyone buys into it, you know, you can make change. So I feel, you know, maybe I'm an optimist, but I do feel that, you know, we've got opportunities to make those changes.
It's interesting. And so if we think into the sort of aid and development sector, with all the challenges and contradictions that we know about it, we talked about, and you and I have talked about before, like, what do you think needs to happen in the sector to kind of open up to this creative thinking that you've been talking about? Call it creative feminist leadership. I don't know how we term it, but like, what needs to happen? What's your, because you talked at the beginning about like, we need to imagine the future. We need to imagine a future. If we could just imagine it now, what would it look like? What might it look like?
How long have you got? I mean, in general, or maybe we should stick to the sector. That was your first question, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. Yeah.
The feminist future is about, you know, having donor economics and all sorts of things. But okay, let's just stick for the time being with the sector itself. And I think the crisis in this sort of sexual harassment and so on that we've been talking about today is really the tip of the iceberg, and it's not new. And I can remember being in as one of the first black VSO volunteers, that I was often, if I was out and about with a male volunteer, people thought I was a sex worker, prostitute, immediately. And I realized that the way people were talking to me, that was an assumption that a black woman with a white man was what used to be called prostitutes. So I realized very early on in my career that there was this dynamic between the sort of white savior mentality and this sense of entitlement. So I think that basically, you know, notwithstanding the fact that the organizations have done some fantastic work at different points in history, I think that it's way beyond its sell-by date, and that if you look at some of the the anti-racist movements and Black Lives Matter and so on, and the criticism of that David Lammy has leveled at the sector. In fact, whenever I go back to Ghana, my cousins who are kind of doctors and head teachers and professionals in the city, not so much the people in my village who are subsistence farmers, but the ones who are in a professional situation are saying to me, well, you know, we'll come and take pictures of homeless people under Vauxhall Bridge and go back and spread it on the hoardings in Accra and say, give generously, you know, Britain's trouble, you know. So that I just think that the way the sector is going back to I think it's returned to that kind of crisis, starving people type of mentality, which I think is, you know, it's never what we needed, but it certainly isn't now. And it's a big turn off to such a diverse population as we have now. So in answer to your question, I think the sector's got to look and feel totally different. It's got to actually kind of dissolve and reform. It's got to become more political, less hierarchical, smaller. You know, they say that if you get an organization beyond about 150 people, it loses sight of itself and it starts to have a life of its own and want to exist beyond its usefulness. So you want small organizations, more responsive, recognize that the world has changed since their establishment, and that the nature of inequality and poverty has changed. And I think we will all still be engaged still, but in different ways and with organizations with a different entity. And this idea of flow and freedom that we've been talking about, that's really, you know, that's the essence of it. They got to be feminist, collective, collaborative leadership. And I think we have to change the ownership. It's got to be owned by activists across the globe, north and south together. Forget about this dichotomy dichotomy of over here and over there, and think of ourselves as a social justice movement, a part of a social justice movement, which is, you know, got lots of other people in it, feminist organizations, you know, environmental organizations, which are gathering this momentum. We should see ourselves as part of that and fighting for all of our rights to survive. You know, poverty, the people down the road from me, you know, queuing outside the food banks. So we've got to think of the world as a very, very different place. And I think we need to change the language, ditch the idea of aid and development, think of, as I say, of ourselves as a radical, progressive part of a movement for social change. And to my mind, the diaspora should be part of that leadership mix in our organizations. We spend 4 times the amount of money as the entire aid and development sector, including governments in the world, and we pay much higher taxes. When I send money home to my village for you know, to help with the school and all of that, you know, we talk the language of heritage, identity, connection, anti-racism, very different language from the aid and development sector. I'm not saying we haven't got privileges, and it's not simple, you know. There's still power dynamics in it, but it's a different, we're coming from a very different place, I think, as one of your speakers said earlier on. And I think we need structures that have got power sharing at their heart and respect, and work alongside all these other movements, the participatory thing, obviously. And I think we need to change that infrastructure as well, because I was talking to an organization which is called, now let's think about the Institute for Governance Professionals. Okay. I found myself in front of this 80 people who were all in, you know, in charge of boards and governance and so on. I said, you have got to abolish yourselves, really, if you really want to make a difference. The whole concept of boards, I can remember being at in Anne Hathaway's cottage, Shakespeare, and we had a feminist historian showing us around this cottage, right? And she goes into the dining room hall thing, and she says, anybody here serves on a board? And I said, yeah, I do, you know, I've been on the boards, lots of different boards, I work with boards. And she said, well, this is where it comes from. There's the chair, and this board is a long table, right? And if you got a seat at the table, you'd be on a bench, right? So you get front benches and back benches. And there's the chair, which is actually a piece of furniture. And she said, this whole language is patriarchal. It's about the only person in the room who had a chair was the patriarch, the dad, you know, the guy, and all his family was sitting around him. And I suddenly thought, that's why we are having such a problem, because the furniture is all wrong, the language is all wrong, and it's still in the boardrooms of today. We've got to get rid of that. And I said to this audience, we need to create, and I was looking for another word, and I said, let's create sounding boards, which are actually people who listen, and people who listen to the impact that the organization is having on the people around it. And those sounding boards need to be looking and feeling and acting and talking like the people that the whole organization exists for, the service users, the people who are engaged in it, the service deliverers, the people who are around and about in the local area. We need to reconfigure the whole way we do governance, and that those people don't need to be sitting around a board, sitting around a table. They need to be out and about, talking to people, engaging. They need to be activists themselves. So I think we can change the whole way we do stuff. It's not a systemic problem. It's not just it's an institutional problem. The institutions themselves and the language they talk has got to change. And I think that will bring us along with new alliances, We will be working with trade unions, community groups, cooperatives, Black Lives Matter, diaspora organisations. The whole of the world is in most capital cities now. We are so diverse. I think we should get rid of capital cities as well, but that's another. But we need to be working with the movements that are there for social change. You know, online and on the streets. There's been more kind of demonstrations around the world than there have been for decades. People are really on the move. They really want to do. They want change. They want to do things. Most of the institutions that we have are in question. You know, democracy itself, all the parliaments. You know, capitalism, patriarchy, socialism. Even people are questioning. And the European Union and all the all the institutions. So I think we need to listen to the voices of different people and make those new alliances, and make sure that we are thinking outside the box about the way we do things.
And I'm reminded of that what you were saying about the European Women's Lobby and the kind of dual strategy as well, like the kind of 50-50 strategy, which is playing to what we have and trying to improve it, and then the kind of strategy for radical change. And I wonder how that might show up in, I don't know whether it's, because I have this conversation a lot with people in different ways. It kind of shows up in different forms, but of like, are we trying to change what is, or do we have to start again? And I think you were offering with that the idea that maybe we don't have to decide. I don't know. What do you think about it? Like this different future for the work in a way that you've outlined. Do you think we can reach it by trying to change what is, or do we just have to start again? Or
yeah, I think we have to do both, really. We've got to be, in a way, feminists have got to be philosophers as well as activists. So the philosopher part of us is reimagining the world in a different space and being very holistic about that. Because, at the moment we're thinking sort of in silos. Are we talking about environmentalism, or are we saving the planet, or are we saving our abortion rights, or are we trying to, limit the damage done by violence against women and get justice for survivors and so on? So we're kind of picking it all off, and it all needs to come together. So what we do by fighting for our rights and being activists is imagine not just what's going wrong, which I think we know, but also imagining how things could be different holistically. So, come up with this new vision. And I think a lot of strategies that I do start with a world absent from something, like a world free from violence, a world free from poverty. And it's a lot of free from, which is a great idea. But, what is this society that would be free from all that? Is not just free from, it's got to be a solid kind of, this is what we're what's the deal? So and there are some very exciting things that that we can do with that, and especially with new economics and the idea that there will be robotization taking over lots of mundane jobs and so on, that is seen as a threat to jobs. But it seems to me that if it frees us up to self-care and look after each other more, then that can only be a good thing. But feminists don't have we haven't had time to have a position on that. What would we do with robots, when they take over? And they are taking over, but so it's about saying, well, we've got to think big, and we've got to think macro really now, because I think because we are fighting a rearguard action all the time, and let's face it, at the moment with the alt-right on the march, they're the ones with the vision, and it's a vision of yesterday that never existed really.
Absolutely.
So we've got to find a utopia and bring back, I think utopia should come back into fashion. There's all sorts of crazy ideas at the moment being put into practice, so we should be able to up with some really good ones of our own, which are much more appealing and much more inclusive of everybody. So I do think we need to get that creative space and get time for it and have a position on things which maybe because of our just trying to fight to stay where we are, we're not giving ourselves time for. But that means the space is being colonized by men who are having all these grand thoughts about, you know, the world as it should be. And what we get is more patriarchy, you know, but a bit less capitalism or something, which is not what we're there for. So I feel it's an exciting time to really start, you know, the institutions are actually broken. And so now it's time to start thinking big.
Thanks, Esua. I wanna do something that we didn't talk about doing, but I mentioned that you're a writer too.
Oh, right.
There's been a lot of conversation today in the previous sessions as well about just kind of bringing ourselves and our stories. And I wondered if you just want to say something about your upcoming book and how it relates. Yeah, and how it relates maybe to this. I don't know.
Well, that's very kind of you. This is not an advertising break. This is about bringing our whole selves. It's something that I sort of took, and I suppose that's why I'm in a philosophical mood, because it's about actually looking at our own experience over, sometimes, you know, some of us have got lifetimes of it, and thinking about how that relates to our practice. And I certainly feel that that space of reflection has been incredibly useful for me in terms of talking about race, gender, ethnicity, identity, its relationship to my feminism, and its relationship to the kind of world I want to live in, but also the excluded voices. And I feel my memoir is called The Space Between Black and White, and it's a memoir about mixed race identity over 6 decades. And so it's about how differences and changes to race, gender, and all of that stuff has changed. Even the language has changed over years, and how there are still voices whose stories have yet to be told. And we need to sort of claim that thinking space, and that in telling our stories, they're probably the stories of a lot of other people who say, yes, you know, that, and I've read stories like that. And so I hope it will be that sort of contribution, but also a contribution to thinking, okay, what sort of world do we want in which all these stories can be told, where there's a space for them, but not only listening to stories, but also thinking, well, what kind of institutions and organizations are we going to create out of that? What kind of society are we going to create out of that? Out of, you know, those myriad stories, because I think that's all part of what we've been talking about today, isn't it? To get that mosaic of diversity. And I think there's I think one of your speakers said, diversity is not easy, it's difficult, but at the same time, it leads to richer conversations, better decisions, a better way of doing things, and that sort of inclusivity that we're all looking for. And so it's added value. And I think people get afraid of it because they think it's going to dissipate the movement, distract from the fight that's on. But it seems to me that what it does is add more people to it who, you know, feel included in it. So it's more power. Back to this thing about how to create more power, how to create more leadership. You create that space by understanding people's stories and where they're coming from. So that is a really important landscape that we need to explore.
Yeah, and I also want to highlight, when the book comes out, it's also your leadership story too. I have the privilege of having read it, so I think I'm going to just say that and let people look through it and follow Esua and look through it when it comes out next year, because it is also a story about leadership from that place of your story. as a mixed race person in this country. So it's really interesting. Yeah. So if anyone has questions, there's a few more. We're going to close soon this session, and then the next session will be with Shireen on the hour in the UK. If you're somewhere where there's half hours, then on the whatever that is, half hour. So if anyone has a question about anything that we talked about in this session, please feel free to ask it, or if you just think of one later, you can also find us in the collective. We'll be sharing the conversations, and there'll be a conversation about the topics in them there later, so it's not the end of it if you don't ask it now. But so I don't see any right now.
But thank you, Marianne.
Oh, you're welcome.
It's been brilliant, and I shall keep on watching. Great speakers, and you hold it together. Yeah, facilitative leadership. Thank you.
Thanks, Esua. Is there anything else you'd like to say before we close, or
a lot, I'm sure, but just thank you for this space, and you know, it to be continued, and I hope that people will pick up on the and the whole question of envisaging another society, so that perhaps later we can have a discussion about what that would look like and what the building blocks are, because as you say, we need to connect the two things together, our activism at the moment and, you know, a destination, but there's a pathway to it in which we don't drop either of those things. You know, we need to be, that needs to be a continuum. You build on your experience to build a better future. Definitely.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really love that example, as I'm just going to repeat it again, from the European Women's Lobby, where you're talking about, you know, well, what can we do now? And also, what do we imagine as the future? I think it's so important for us to imagine something that's different and think about how we get to that. So thanks so much for sharing that.
Thank you.
All right. Take care. And thanks everyone for joining this session. And we'll be back on the hour with Shireen from JAS. So see you soon. Bye.
Bye.